I will let our wonderful panel of speakers introduce themselves, and welcome to Engaging the Media, Know Your Target.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Jen Ellis. I am something at Rapid7. And, as something at Rapid7, I have both worked with the media as a PR person, pitching to them and trying to help our spokespeople and our partners tell stories in the best way possible. And I've also more recently become a spokesperson myself, which is a very weird thing when you make the leap from puppet master to puppet. And so it's an uncomfortable experience. Bottom line is that I've worked with media for a long time, including all of these fine gentlemen right here. We have 5 reporters who work in a pretty wide range of titles with different audiences, but all of whom are reporters who specialize in security. They've covered security for a long time. They write predominantly about security topics regularly. And so they know this community, they've interacted with people in this community for a long time. They're highly invested in this community learning how to engage with the media in the best way possible because it benefits them. So they're going to talk a little bit about their experiences today. And then in the second session, which if you care to stay for, they're going to talk about, they'll actually do much more sort of workshop-y type stuff on how you can pitch to them. And you'll have the opportunity to actually pitch to them here and now and maybe get a story written. Exciting. I'm very confused to see that there is at least one other reporter in the audience here to figure out how it is that you pitch to media. But I would say like these guys are really good guys. A quick note for the Cavalry, I don't know how familiar people are, but generally speaking, you know, we're all about trying to connect security expertise with manufacturers and policymakers, people who basically are making decisions that impact how security is built in to technology. And as part of that, we need to help technical people become better advocates, better storytellers, better able to translate the technical knowledge that they have. So that's the sort of rationale behind pretty much the entire track is all about how you build ambassadors, but specifically this session and the next one are focused on how you do that through media, which is obviously like a vitally important platform when you want to disseminate information broadly. So on that note, I'm going to ask the panelists just to run down and introduce themselves quickly, emphasis on quickly, and then we'll jump right in. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'm Ian Thompson. I'm a reporter with the Register and have been covering security for about 10 years, covering IT for about 25. So I think my first article was about this wonderful new thing called multimedia, where you could get videos and pictures and the same thing.
I'm Sean Gallagher. I'm the IT and National Security Editor at Ars Technica. I work with Dan Gooden, our security editor. I've been covering IT for, well, 30 years. And prior to that, I was a naval officer, an information security officer. And so I've had a little bit of a look at both sides of things. And currently, I do the dance between doing day-to-day news coverage of security issues and running our own testing labs at Ars Technica.
Steve Ragan, Senior Staff Writer at CSO Online, Managing Editor of Salted Hash, and prior to getting into journalism, I worked in the security field for about 10 years. So I've been doing security now for just over a decade, and I still do day-to-day news, but focus more on investigative pieces lately.
I'm Joseph Cox from Motherboard, which is the technology section of Vice, cybersecurity, digital underground, surveillance industry. As you can probably tell, I'm probably the youngest here. I've only been doing journalism about 5 years. So hopefully I can bring some naivety to the discussion.
I got that built in. I'm Paul Wagenseil. I'm the senior editor in charge of security coverage at Tom's Guide and Laptop Magazine. Despite that title, I probably am the shallowest person here since I basically we don't really I cover basically breaking news. I do have people write feature pieces on really consumer-oriented security, trying to reach the average reader. Basically, the most kind of really consumer-facing stuff. So, you know, I don't deal with the really technical stuff, but I also have to learn how to translate stuff to very general audiences, and I also go on TV a lot to explain things to even more general audiences, which is helpful.
All right, thank you guys. So, as your presence here kind of indicates, generally speaking, there are media at conferences. Lots of people who work in security attend conferences, so they are probably going to interact with you either directly or indirectly. What should people be aware of? What should they be thinking about when they attend conferences in terms of sort of press interaction?
Basically, be aware that anything you say is on the record. If this is one of the big things that I find going from the UK to the US. In the US, if someone says off the record, that's supposed to mean off the record. In the UK, and for most of the journalism industry, unless you say this is specifically off the record, everything else is open.
Yeah, so it's key to understand that when you're in a public environment, like a conference, any conversation you're having out in the open is probably going to be listened to by anyone around you, and one of those people might be a member of the press. And that's why the B-Sides hooks give us these pink badges, so that we are...
Hey, listen to red. It's usually red.
It's usually pink. I think usually we want to stand out a bit more.
They're radioactive.
That's right. So we have a half-life. That being said, it's important to understand who you're talking around if you're not in a position to speak publicly. But we also, as journalists, are not necessarily out looking for... some of us are not out looking for a specific story, overhearing something that somebody says at a conference. Others may be. We've run across that a few times, even in places where it was theoretically off the record. There have been stories about things that people said that really should not have ever made it to a story because there had been agreement in advance that it shouldn't have been covered.
You can give me an example.
An example. So Marcus.
Actually, instead of Marcus,
Yeah.
let's do one that's related to Cavalry.
Okay.
As Jen said earlier, this is policymakers connecting people.
Right.
So a few years ago at DEF CON, I'm walking, we were at the Rio, and those of you who were there at DEF CON at the Rio, you remember this mile-long walk to go from the con all the way to the front of the hotel. And there's about 700 people in this hallway. We're all moving. It's like a big herd of cattle. We're just walking up this thing. And there's people having conversations all around me, including one individual who's working on a policy thing that this individual should not be talking about. Now, I had known that this policy thing was in the works, but I didn't know who was involved. I didn't know really what the goals were, the aims were. And I knew some of the people who were either on the outskirts trying to get it to work or, what have you, but I didn't have the whole picture until I started walking behind this individual who was casually telling his friend about everything that's going on with this initiative. And the thing is, this particular initiative was sensitive. If the policymakers involved had got wind that the press especially, but anybody else had gotten details and knowledge about what they were working on, they were afraid it was going to be scrapped. So if it had came out, or if it had leaked, it got back to them, this could have been disastrous. Yet this individual is just walking up the hallway discussing everything that's going on. Now, this is one of the few times I've given Jen a heart attack because she was my meeting I was walking to, and when I sat down, I looked her dead in the eye and said, so tell me about blah, and explained what I knew.
Yeah, it was my initiative.
And it was very funny to see the blood drain from her face. But all of that happened because somebody was having a conversation and was not aware of who was standing around them. Now, I could have written a story about that, but short term, I would have gotten a great story. Long term, I would have lost several sources. It's not worth it for me, so I didn't do anything. But that's my take on how to do something. Another journalist wouldn't do that, which is why it's imperative you understand where you are and what you say is on the record. Even if you're not talking to a journalist, they can use it.
And just to bounce back on that a little bit, everybody's a journalist now. If you've got a Twitter account, if you've got a blog, they still call them blogs?
Ask Joe, he's the youngest.
If you've got vlogs, if you have a YouTube channel,
Pivot to video.
right? those people are journalists, and the traditional media is no longer just the sole source of journalism. So anything you say could end up in a tweet. That's the way it is. Anything you say could end up on a Facebook post that gets shared across the entire internet. I mean, that's the way it is. So you need to be aware of your surroundings. If you're having a conversation with somebody and it's something that you really don't want to end up shared with the rest of the world, you need to have a conversation someplace where that's not going to happen.
I mean, it's probably helpful to explain why that's actually the case. So if you only quote something that's been nice and approved and you've got a cute little embargo and the press people have, signed it off and everything, you're not necessarily presenting reality, and we're not exactly doing our jobs. So some people, researchers, PRs, whoever they may be, they may think they would be inappropriate for a journalist just to report something they overheard. But yeah, if you're not going to be presenting reality, you're going to be presenting something plastic instead. And ultimately, some people may think we're assholes, and a lot of people think I'm an asshole, but we have a job to do. And it's kind of bouncing off what Steve said. Sometimes you may not bend the rules, because that sounds manipulative, but you may make editorial decisions that will benefit other stories in the future. You may overhear something, you may not necessarily write about it, even though you can do. So it's probably just worth bearing in mind why a journalist would actually do that in the first place.
One of the things we have to learn in this industry in particular is balance. I have to learn when not to write a story versus when to write a story, because when you cover security, particular vulnerabilities and things that happen really quickly in our industry, our words have impact, not just because of a given vendor looks bad, but their customers could be at risk from something we've written. Because what happens if I go in too deep of technical details on a vulnerability and somebody comes along and says, I understand what he's talking about, I could recreate this attack and now I'm going to go off on their own. You've got to be really careful with what you write. And the thing is, especially here at Black Hat, I will hear vendors discuss their vulnerabilities in enough detail to where if I wanted to, I could write about that, and there's a risk that somebody could go through and recreate an attack. You never want that.
No, but until there's a patch, then you need to get
once it's patched and fixed, that's a different matter entirely. But when it's still live and things are going on, you have to be really careful with what you're writing about and how you do it, because your words have an impact far beyond just clicks and views.
It's the same thing as ethical disclosure.
Yeah.
With any sort of bug. We were in the same sort of situation.
So let me ask you, so Joe said that, as reporters reporting on what's really happening in the world, it's your responsibility to report what you hear. And Steve gave an example of when he chose not to write about something to make sure that he didn't do damage. So how do you decide? What are the criteria that you look at to determine whether it's worth writing about something that you've overheard?
The very first rule is, does the public have a right to know this? Do they absolutely need to know this? And if the answer to that question is yes, then no other question matters. The story gets written. That's because right. It is my job to expose the truth to the public, to make sure everybody's informed and that people in power are held accountable. In our industry, and when you say that, what we mean is that the vendors that are putting out products, they're not doing anything shady. They're not abusing the data or the authority or the relative control they have over their customers. They don't abuse that. We're the ones that hold them in check for that stuff. So that's the first thing, is does the public need to know?
And also I'd add that, in terms of the pressure that you can put on companies to actually get their software updates out online. I mean, Oracle is the key case in this. They sit on patches for 6 to 12 months. One of the things I admire about some security researchers is that they are saying, right, you have a deadline. We've identified this vulnerability. You can deal with it or you can't deal with it. But within 30 days or 90 days or whatever, we're going to get out there. And that's the only way you get software fixed.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, one of the things I look at when I do stories is whether it's something that's actionable, whether it's a piece of information that somebody can take and actually do something to either protect themselves or protect others, or make a decision that's important to them. I mean, if it's something that's just a fact, it's just a fact that is detached from context, then what's the point of reporting it? I mean, then what does the public need to know in that sort of situation? But if it's something that has context around it that is important. That's something where, that piece of information could inform people on making a decision to protect their privacy, to protect their security. Then it's something that we want to cover as quickly as possible. And sometimes that means taking a few steps back and talking to the vendors first, but we're eventually going to cover the story.
I mean, kind of on the flip side of that is what you decide to omit, and we've kind of touched upon that. We deal with a lot of data breaches, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of user accounts, or especially recently focusing on malware that's used in domestic violence and to facilitate stalking and rape. We're not going to print the names of people who are being stalked, or necessarily the people who are actually carrying out those crimes either, unless they're a public official or there's some sort of overriding public interest. The public interest is in the breach itself and what the data is being used for. We're in quite a strange beat in that, I mean, I wouldn't say majority, but a lot of the stories you're going to have this trade-off between what you're going to omit and what you're going to publish, and you don't necessarily get that in all journalistic beats.
Nope. As an example on that, I just wrote a story that ran today on hunting down fishing kits and hunting down fishers. And I published the email of an individual who had entered that email into his fishing kits because I felt, that's something worth publishing because we're identifying the person who's involved in the operation, at least by their email address. I wouldn't normally print somebody's email address. I wouldn't normally say give somebody a URL to someplace they're going to go and find bad things. But in this case, it was somebody who was running a bunch of different phishing sites, and he advertised his skill by even having his nom de hack in his custom web shell that he installed in every site he operated a phishing site off of. I figured we might as well give out his web address, give out his email address, so everybody knew where to get a hold of him.
You're helping him with his branding.
That's right.
Free advertising.
I mean, I won't go into this deeply because it is kind of going on a side note, but that idea of advertising, we do, when we omit information, we sometimes decide to get rid of that explicitly for that reason. Hackers contact me a lot. Obviously, they all have motivations. A lot of them want free advertising for their new data dump, whatever it may be. Right. A lot of them will say, hey, can you put my Jabber handle, my XMPP handle in here? Because obviously they want to be contacted. Yeah. No, the reader does not need to know how to get hold of this data. Then sometimes the hackers will go somewhere else, and then you'll see a piece on various tech blogs that will go unnamed, and they all have the Jabber handle in them. So clearly the journalist has made an agreement there.
So they're asking you to do their PR.
Yeah, basically.
So.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. And with all that being said, in a way we are still doing their PR, even if we don't include the handle, which is again why you may omit or decide to include certain details, because you have to get that balance between what the public needs to know and not inadvertently giving free advertising to hackers.
In the same vein of criminals advertising and doing like research and what to publish and what not, have any of you in this room seen emails lately that starts off with, I know your password is blah and you're going to pay me? Okay, so I know
they're watching porn.
Yeah, I've been tracking down these emails. They started in late June, and I found the group responsible for them. And I know what data breach they got their stuff from. But the thing is, this data breach has only partially been exposed, which means this company had a problem that was much bigger than what they thought. So now, what do? Do I write about everything, or do I give them time to fix this and figure out the scale and scope? And the answer to that question is you give them time to fix it. Because I don't want to risk, before I have all my ducks in a row, an absolute proof. Because I need 2 sources on a data breach and 2 sources on the emails before I can print this. I have to verify and prove things, right? Well, for right now, I've got enough information to go to this company and say, your problem is much bigger than you thought. You need to do some work, so they're going to dig into it, and maybe there's something there, maybe there's not. But before I have that proof, I can't write this story yet. But it's been an ongoing investigation, so you have to really balance what you're writing, because I have enough right now. If I wanted to embarrass myself, and if I'm wrong, I could totally put this company on blast, but I won't. I'd rather have my facts in order. Go ahead.
Okay, so for some of us who have good password hygiene, I know exactly where that password came from because I only use it in one place. So there are people you could probably find in the community who could independently confirm your suppositions, who really don't care to have their names quoted, they don't want to be part of it, but you could turn to them as a resource to say, hey, You do this for a living. Does this look right?
So not only have I considered that, that is what I do.
Okay.
And the thing is, I got one of those emails, and I know where it came from as well, because there's only one place I used that password they wrote. But just having that, that's still not enough to print. It's not enough. It's not enough for me. I want that company on record. I have to have more than just a passive thing. But that's my standard. Not every journalist is like that. Everybody's different. But yeah, I mean, that's when you have to balance what you know and what you don't know, and what you run with and what you don't.
So just for the recording, I'm not sure if it would have picked this up, but the point was reporters having people in their network that they can use as third-party corroboration when they're investigating something, which I'm sure everybody sitting at this table does.
Yes.
And actually also their own skills, because they've been doing this so long that they've developed their own skills. So that might actually be a good point to talk about the difference between on the record, off the record, on background, and Chatham House.
All right, so first we're going to do the really easy one most of you are familiar with, off the record. All right, off the record is really simple. I cannot use your name. I cannot use what you've told me. I can't use anything in our conversation. I'm using you as an example because I can just look at you right now. So you and I are talking. Nothing you tell me can I go and do in a story. But here's the problem. Everything you've told me, I can go to him and say, hey, I heard. Have you heard anything? And now I'm going to get an on-the-record source for the information you told me. That's exactly what a reporter is supposed to do. But because you were off the record, you're not going to be in the story. But if he confirms what you said, that can go into the story. On background means that you and I are going to have a conversation, but I'm not going to name you. I might quote you. I might use what you've said in the story, but you're not going to be named. You'll sometimes hear that as not for attribution. But what that means is when you see a story that says sources close to the investigation, a senior White House official, or what have you, that's a not for attribution quote that's on background.
People familiar with the matter.
Yep.
Yes.
And then you have on the record. The easiest way to remember this is on the record is always, and you will always be quoted, and everything you say on the record can and will be used against you. And that means all of your quotes are going to be headlines, especially if you said something inflammatory or if you said something that catches somebody's attention. There's a good bet you'll see that prominently in the article. But it's easier for you to remember, and this is what we started our conversation on. Everything you say is on the record. The only way you go on background, the only way you go off the record is if you have a really good relationship with that particular journalist, and that takes a lot of time to build. Trust is not something you just give away. Trust is earned. So unless you absolutely trust that reporter, you never go off the record. And you should only go on background sparingly, because you don't want us to constantly have to rely on you as an on-background source when eventually you're going to burn bridges enough to where your motives would be questioned. If you constantly want to stay on the background or try to go off the record, we're going to dig into why. What's your motive for coming to talk to us? Why are you here? What are we looking for? So there's a lot that goes into that, but it's a relationship status and trust. So the more you work with a journalist, maybe you trust them more. That's where you get your variations.
For anyone, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but Chatham House rule.
Right.
That's the interesting one that actually in D.C., Paul and Sean and I had a good conversation about that. What was the dinner? The Chatham House rules. You have a story.
That was the one where Marcus got.
Yeah.
So
That's a good story.
So malware tech blog. I think everybody knows him as Marcus Hutchins.
He's not in the room, but he's here. I invited him. He might show up.
He was at DEF CON last year, and there was a Chatham House Rules dinner. So Chatham House Rules means, generally speaking, that what's said in the room can leave the room, but you're not supposed to attribute it to anybody in the room. It's supposed to be information shared with colleagues. So it's essentially the same thing as on background, but there's some variation on it. So it was a dinner, and he was sitting down at a table and having a conversation about all the things he was doing in town, because he was with his company, and they had rented out a mansion as their place to stay in town on Airbnb, and pretty reasonable when you have that many people to stay in a big house. And I think it came down to be cheaper than a hotel based on the math I did. And he's a visitor to the United States. Always a good time to use a firearm. Drive around in souped-up rental cars, because that's what Vegas is all about, right? You get a rental car, drive around in a rental car, go out to the gun range and shoot an automatic weapon.
All perfectly legal.
All perfectly legal, yes. Even for foreigners, right? Even for visiting.
Geeks don't kill people.
Yes.
Geeks with guns
kill people, right. So he was discussing all this with a young reporter who was at the time working for The Outline, who was at the table. And yeah, I won't name him right now because he's technically a minor.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Doesn't excuse
he's under
his
21.
actions, but yes.
So in any case, he when Marcus Hutchins got arrested, the young journalist from The Outline then wrote up everything he said in this conversation and made it as scandalous as possible in the way it sounded. Like he was living high in the hog, stayed in a mansion, and was driving expensive cars, went out and shooting firearms.
Total bullshit hit.
And so the FBI used that as reason to put a hold on him to prevent him from being released on bail, because he had done these things, and so he was a risk to the public. It was a conversation that should have never made it into a publication. It was, let alone making it the basis of an article. So that's why, when you're having conversations with people who are journalists of a certain type, you need to really understand who the journalist is before you have a conversation with them, and also you need to make sure that it's clear, even though the rules were stated at the beginning, that this is all off the record. This is all not for you cannot print any of this. This is just for your information.
Yeah, and for us, you got to realize that made us all look bad. It really did. I mean, that personally upset me, that article. I've met both the people involved. They're both perfectly nice people in general, but I couldn't support that move on that part of that journalist. It was too much of a burn. There was no real upside other than a quick hit, a day and a half's worth of clickbait, and then your credibility is shot. My credibility is shot.
Show of hands, how many of you have had media training or dealt directly with a journalist?
Good.
Okay, so I want you to think about that interview and interaction you had with the journalist, okay? I want you to think about how you felt at the end of that interview. Was it a good interview? Is that somebody you would talk to again? Did you feel like that they understood what you were talking about and you were comfortable talking to them about that given topic? You didn't have to repeat yourself or try to explain something. They were on the same page with you the whole time. This is the type of mechanic you look for when you evaluate a journalist. This is how you know who you're talking to and what you're discussing. The problem is you can't do that with every journalist you see in a room, like even with us sitting here on the stage, because we've never interviewed you. You don't know us. So when we talk about the hit piece that eventually came out of that one particular dinner, there was no way for Marcus to have known that that a journalist was going to write what eventually became a hit piece based off some passive conversation, which is how that story was developed. And so you have to really be careful with what you're saying and always assume, unless you know that person really well, everything you say is eventually going to wind up in a story. That's the easiest way to exist when it comes to on the record, off the record, on background, etc.
Okay, so you know the journalist, and you're taking a leap of faith, and you're going to go off the record or on background. What is the golden rule of this? What do you always do before you start?
Make an agreement, like a very explicit agreement where the journalist, or maybe the source will say, can we go off the record? And the journalist will say yes. And now the reason you do that, and this happens all the time because I work with people who are not media trained. They're teenage cybercriminals, organized cybercriminals who don't really give a shit about media norms, and they will say, blah, 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 off the record this. And I sometimes, especially for the teenage ones, and this may be a slightly controversial point, I will explain to them explicitly why you can't do that, why it's problematic, and then I will say maybe at the beginning, hey, if you want to be anonymous here, you have to say now. And you don't do that with all sources, but when I'm dealing with minors and people who are not media trained, it sometimes feels appropriate to give them that heads up.
Clearly not me. Clearly not media trained. It's in our interest to kind of give you a brief primer. And we can tell that you're not media trained simply by the way you act when we approach you and we ask some baseline questions. A lot of people who are not used to the media are very nervous when they talk to us. They're kind of jittery. They stumble through a lot of their points and
very
questions.
intimidating.
And so it's a thing to where you kind of have to walk them through these steps and calm them down. And that is one way to build a rapport, also to get a baseline established with the interview subject. But yeah, go ahead.
We're the nice guys if we do that. I mean, honestly, there are plenty of reporters who are going to be like cops who basically just let you incriminate yourself without, getting Mirandized.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem. I don't necessarily have a problem with someone incriminating themselves if it's in the public interest.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm okay to come out as the asshole on the panel, but I don't have a problem with that. Yeah, exactly. But it's not necessarily our job to protect these sources, unless, of course, you're talking about anonymous sources off the record and keeping to all those agreements. If somebody makes a decision to go hack a hospital or whatever it may be, they've made that decision. I'm going to report on it. It's not my job to stop them getting indicted, right?
I can give you a very specific example of that. There was a gentleman who was a contractor for the University of Maryland, and he decided to take it into his hands to show that there was a breach at the University of Maryland by publishing the president of the university's social security number on Reddit.
Jesus. Yeah, I remember this kid.
Yeah, that was a doozy of a case.
Address, name, date of birth.
Yeah, so David was his name. I'm not going to get into the rest of his name because he's gone on to other things now. But you can Google it. He decided he would talk to me because I knew where he lived and I had his phone number and I gave him a call and he said, yeah, let's sit down for lunch and I'll tell you everything. And he literally told me everything he did. And I said, have you talked to a lawyer about this before? I stopped him and I said, okay, you realize you've been questioned by the FBI and you're going to, you may be prosecuted. Are you want to do this? He said, yeah, I talked to my lawyer. I'm going to do this. I said, okay. And from then on, I just went with the story because, I gave this guy an opportunity to not hang himself, but he went to great lengths to explain to me how he Google dorked his way into a shell at University of Maryland and found a back door into their Drupal environment found the Drupal files and found the hard-coded password into their system, into their Oracle database that ran their LDAP. And he got all the social security numbers for every student at the school and every faculty member, and he decided that this was really bad, and he just couldn't go through normal channels to handle this, so he published the president's social security number on Reddit. Yeah. And then claimed to be a gray hat hacker in some very cryptic emails, and that didn't end well for him. It actually ended very well for him because he didn't get prosecuted, but it didn't end well for him in terms of his employment. So in that case, I, at a certain point, stopped myself from stopping him because he just wouldn't stop talking.
Which is a really important point that, there are cases, and I'll only speak for myself. I'll let these guys weigh in for their own thoughts, but there are plenty of times when I'm going to go out of my way to try and stop you from hanging yourself, but there are also times when I'm going to give you all the rope you want. And I'm going to keep giving you all the rope you want because this story is more than my personal thoughts on the matter. So I've talked to executives who have gone completely off the rails from their talking points and during the interview, and they have said things that you just would not believe, that like the PR person that's on the call with them is in tears. Please stop. Please don't say anymore. And they keep going. I've once had a company, a well-known company, whose their own lawyer gave me quotes that made them look, their own legal team was talking to me, basically just going completely against the grain. And I could have stopped it, but why? You knew who I was when you called. You called me. I'm not going to stop you from doing that. So yeah, just again, know who you're talking to, and just remember the easiest rule is everything you say is on the record, always.
Yeah.
So three quick points, just as an encapsulation then of what we just talked about with this, is exactly as Steve just said, err on the side of being on the record. You should only go into a different state in extreme circumstance, and anybody who works with PR or comms professionals in your organization, you should only ever do it at their say-so. They should have the decision making on that. Number two, be explicit that you're changing the status before you give the information, not after, or it doesn't count. You can't. There's no go backs and redos. And number three, when you do it, you get their explicit agreement. They have to say the words to you. It's not like you can say we're going to go off the record and they nod or they grunt or they go yeah. If they do that, you just sit and look at them. And then if they really want you to continue, they'll say, yes, we're off the record. Literally at lunch, took two of the panelists out and said, hey, everything at lunch is, and they both said, off the record. And I was like, great, we can proceed. Did I buy you lunch? It was.
To her point, also keep in mind, rarely will the journalist offer you on the or off the record or background. You have to request it. We won't walk you into that. We're going to just let you talk. So you have to understand the rules before you start talking and know what you want out of that conversation.
But also you have to agree to it.
Yeah.
It's this is one of the key cases when Tony Blair, the warmongering former prime minister of my country, when his kid was talking about his kid getting inoculated, someone was talking about it and then pointed at the tape recorder and put their finger up to their lips, and it's just like, that's not off the record. If you want to get off the record, you have to get the journalist to say, yes, we are off the record. You have to get that agreement. Otherwise, it's all for grabs.
And even if you do, if the recorder is still turned on, it's still on the record. I mean, honestly, you got to make sure that if you're talking with somebody off the record, they don't have a pen in their hand.
Yep.
They don't have a recorder turned on. They don't have their iPhone turned upside down with recorder on. Make sure they're not recording a conversation that is committed to memory.
It's really just very easy. Just get them to say so. I mean, I have to agree to embargoes all the time for product releases or whatever, and I literally have to say, yes, I agree to the embargo, and I will honor the embargo. And it's the same thing with off the record. Yes, I will go off. Yes, this is off the record. Or even if you can just say, is this off the record? And you will say yes, but that's usually enough. It's better to say it all, spell it all out.
But you have to agree to it.
Yeah.
Right.
So you mentioned recording, and a lot of reporters do record the conversations they have. Should spokespeople be worried about that? Should they be recording it on their side? What are your views on it?
Yes, or they should not be worried about it, and yes, they should record on their side. Yeah. Because first of all, recording equals accuracy. I mean, if I record something, that means if I'm not going to make a mistake in my notes, because I'm going to listen to that several times over, or I'm going to have somebody transcribe it and compare it against my notes and listen to the recording after I see the transcription to make sure I got exactly what I thought I got. You want to have your own recording of the conversation because of the reasons we've talked about, in terms of when you say something is off the record. You want to have a recording of them saying, yes, it's off the record.
You want to cover your ass.
And you also, if the reporter writes something that is contrary to what you said, you want to have a record of what you actually said to them to be able to show that they weren't accurate.
To be honest, and we're kind of lazy. I mean, I'm a lazy journalist when I have to be, or when I can be. But it's actually, if you are answering a journalist's questions, it is often best to do so via email. You know exactly what you're writing. The journalist knows exactly what he or she is getting. There's no ambiguity most of the time. I know that seems kind of dry, and it's often faster and more expedient to have a conversation, but conversation, there is nuance. Things can be interpreted different ways. With email, that's not really the case.
I mean, we're talking a lot about print journalism here, but of course there is audio and visual as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. And if you are recording a conversation and the source believes it's for print, and then you try to use it for a podcast, as the New York Times recently did, and there was kind of a controversy around that, it's kind of an open question, because I don't think it's an exact science, but if you have an inkling maybe that it's going to be used for a podcast and maybe you don't consent to that, you can maybe make that viewpoint known. It doesn't mean the journalist is going to agree, and then maybe you can stop the interview or whatever it may be, but just bear in mind that audio recordings can be used for various different purposes, especially as online media becomes much more multimedia focused as well, because we publish audio recordings as well sometimes.
And video. I mean, we're all in the video business now too.
We might actually want to touch upon broadcast media, radio and TV, because that is kind of a big part of my job. And I don't know how much experience you guys have with it. I mean,
we had a case recently where we were getting involved with somebody who was trying to recreate an old computer, and they said, "Well, we didn't say what you said you say, so we published the audio transmission. If you're doing an interview, you should record it, and the person you're interviewing should also record it. That way, you know what is being said is done."
How does the spokesperson handle that then? So the article comes out, and you go back to the recording that you personally made, and because you look at it and you think that doesn't look right, so you go back to your recording and you verify it's not what you said. How should the person then handle that with the reporter?
They're basically, from my perspective, would be, contact the reporter, say, this is an error. I need a correction from you on this. This is what was said. We have audio of it here. If you want to check our audio to make sure that you didn't mishear, be accommodating in that way.
And what should they expect as a desired outcome from that?
They should expect a correction.
Okay.
Yeah.
They should expect a correction. If I write something and it is incorrect, and somebody informs me, and I am in error, I'm going to correct it. And usually, unless it's a very minor error, I'm going to say in the story, there's an updated, and we previously reported X. It's not correct. This is the truth. And if you don't get that kind of an outcome, the next step is to go to the editor-in-chief of a publication, and then after that it gets to legal.
Yep.
But if you've got a recording, then you have grounds for basically saying, it's not depending upon what the law of the land is. I mean, you're basically, unless it's something that's flagrant, it's not going to get you. You're not going to get anything out of court out of it. But it is good. You also can then use it to punish the person in public. So security Twitter, dangerous place. You say something wrong and it ends up on social media or ends up in another publication, things like that, where if somebody prints something wrong and it gets shown to be wrong by someone else in public, it does great damage to the reputation of the publication that did the wrong thing.
Definitely.
But it's unhackable. What are you talking about?
Because it's on the blockchain.
I didn't know John McAfee was in the audience tonight.
So all of these nice people have all of these nice people have come here and they've met you guys, and they'll come and chat with you afterwards, and you'll all become besties, and you'll go to the bar and you'll have some drinks. Like, you guys are all BFFs now forever, right? And so, like, they can tell you whatever they want. They can get hammered with you. Like, this is a thing.
It doesn't work that way. I'm sorry. I mean, okay, case in point, about, 15 years ago, I've been in this industry that long, Microsoft put out a press release survey where they said, they'd done like 2,000 CIOs, and 32% were willing to go into cloud. This is how old this thing is. And we got the press release, and it was like, great, more than 2/3 of people don't want to go into cloud. And Microsoft PR called me up and just like, that's not the angle we were looking for. It's like, well, that's not my job. But, once you put the information out there, you don't have any control over where it's done. So put the information out there in the best way you can, but don't expect us to be very nice about it.
And we're journalists 24/7. Except when I declare I'm not a journalist because I have a drink in my hand, and that's a totally different situation. I mean, you have to know the person you're dealing with, and you have to have ground rules you've established with them before you have a conversation with them at any time.
Yeah.
You also have to understand that their job, it's a lifestyle. I mean, my job at ours does not end at the end of a normal workday any day. My wife is a saint and puts up with me doing projects that run into the weekends and late hours on a regular basis, especially when I'm like chasing down fishing people. But the fact is,
when Aaron Schwartz died, my wife put aside a holiday weekend, weekend plans, and it was just like, I need to write this. So,
right. So it is a calling. we do this stuff because we like to do it and we feel connected to the community we write about, generally speaking, I think. But also because we feel that we are delivering information people need. And that is a commitment. It means that we're living our jobs most of the time. So even in the most casual conversations I have during the day with people, sometimes I say, hey, that conversation we just had, that's a story. And I hope you don't mind it, but it's not on it wasn't off the record. There's an example of that is I was having a conversation with people who had worked on city stat in Baltimore. And some of them worked in the mayor's office. And there's a ton of stuff that came in the conversation. I said, I'm going to be revisiting this with you, and it probably will be in print. So, and there are people whose kids go to school with my kids. So they all know who I am. They all know what I do. They're okay with it, mostly.
I mean, just on this, kind of bouncing off the point of BFFs forever. So I will admit I have sources who are now friends, but they are no longer sources. And you can't have a friend who then becomes a source. I mean, as you can probably appreciate, this stuff is messy, but if you don't have the ability to address and acknowledge your biases, well, first of all, you shouldn't be doing journalism, and then you also should not be having friends who are working as sources. So if you can't do that, just do not use friends who are sources. And I've lost stories because these people were sources, now they're friends, and we're having beers, and I'm not going to write about this because I actually care about this person. It would be deeply inappropriate if I...
that's a conflict of interest right there. So that's,
exactly.
So we just step back from things like that.
And some people will say that if you have a conflict of interest, it depends obviously on the spectrum of how severe it is. If you just do a disclaimer, it's okay, I used to work at this place or whatever it may be. At that point, there are just some things you just shouldn't be covering, and you shouldn't be quoting if you're particularly close to them, disclaimer or not. I would much rather, obviously it's case dependent, but it's probably better just not to do it and maybe get another reporter to do it who doesn't have that interest, rather than just trying to do like a mortifin disclaimer on the piece.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I would like to open it up to audience questions.
Oh.
Yes.
So now that we're friends, and please off the record, what would you advise Marcus to have done back then in response to the piece?
Well, I wish I was there at the table with them.
No, we need to. So
Okay.
if you can just give me a second to repeat the questions for the. So and I'm actually gonna I'm not gonna make it about that individual. So generally speaking, if a hit piece comes out, how would you respond to such a thing? How would you advise somebody to respond?
Well, under specific circumstances, I would say if it's a hit piece, I would say you want to enlist some help to deal with it. One of the things that I tell people when they're in that sort of situation is they really need to, I can't be their PR person, but they need to have a PR person or somebody who's the person they turn to for advice to have them deal with the situation. They need a third party who can act on their behalf. And you need to be clear about what the issues you have with a story are. You need to outline what the problems with the story are, and you have to be very clear about what you want done to make good for the story. So what will make you whole from having this incorrect story published? And the next step is beyond that, that comes down to PR, really. It comes down to having other people do media for you and overcome the story. And that's why those people are out there doing that job, because you have to have people who you can turn to when there's something said about you that's a hit.
But you see, Marcus didn't have a PR organization behind him.
No,
the guy
didn't.
got screwed, but badly.
He did.
The other go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay,
Finish.
he got screwed badly by a journalist who was willing to fluff himself for ratings. Look, the fact of the matter is, if you're speaking to a journalist, you need to be very, very careful. And you need to have a personal relationship that you understand that this is not how things are done. Marcus got done over badly. But not everyone has a PR team behind them. I have no sympathy with someone from a major networking company or a major software company that says, "Oh, I was done over by a journalist," because you've got armies of PRs behind you. It's the individual hacker who gets screwed over by journos, and that's the way it goes. Because some people are willing to fuck over other people for the clicks.
Yeah. Journalism is supposed to be about, what's the quote? Comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. So you've got to, we as journalists, want to go after stories that have an impact and are have something that people can come away with and learn something from, that they can take action on, or that they can incorporate into their lives, right? And there are other people who are out there who are just going to get who are out for page views.
Right.
Yeah.
There is one key thing, though, that you have to understand. The question, to go back to it, was what happens when somebody writes a hit piece.
Right.
You have to understand what a hit piece is. Just because you're mad at the article or you think the article sucks, that's not a hit piece. That's your feelings being hurt. Sorry for you. Go cry in a corner. A lot of times, because you disagree with the coverage, that does not make it a hit piece. A hit piece is almost like you have a good chance of going to court over it type of story. That's a hit piece.
Right.
Yeah, and they're very, very rare. Very rare. And the thing is, if I can prove what I've written, it's not a hit piece, no matter how much you hate it. And
True.
You can take me to court.
Very true.
And if I can prove it, I'll win. I will win 10 times out of 10. I will win 100 times out of 100. Because all I have to do is prove what I've written. And that's as simple as it gets. The thing is, when you want to try to get what you assume to be a hit piece corrected, you have to prove everything you're saying, because you've got to remember your army, and your armies of PR people would help you. That's why it's good if you've got a PR team to work with them, because they can help you get this done. You have to prove your claims before I'll change my story. Just because you don't like your quote, if I say you've said it and I've got the proof you've did, that's your quote. You have to understand that.
And there's also the Streisand effect.
Yeah, and the thing is, the more you try to fight to change a story, the bigger that story is going to get.
Right.
Yeah. And you've given me the ammunition I need to generate news stories about how you are now attacking a journalist because you really didn't want this out there in the public. Well, now what else do you have to hide? It is very simple to build things onto that.
And Steve and I both have specific examples of that we can talk to you about afterwards.
I think we're
Also, bear in mind that if you're as a journalist in the Bay Area, there are 7 PRs for every journalist in the Bay Area, and they are all trying to push their point of view. And I'm sorry, unless you've got proof, you can fuck off.
No, he's literally told me that when I phoned him. All's been trying to add points. Final point on this.
I mean, mine is really just kind of minor, but you may think it's a hit piece, you may think something's out of context, you may think a journalist is not telling the whole story, but that is, if we're printing the facts, then that's unassailable. Even if we're not giving the whole context, even if we're not telling the other side. We ought to tell the other side, but we don't have to. And when you're trying to hit back against something, you've got to prove that the person did it wrong and something that was not erroneous.
It's imperfect, but that doesn't make it bad.
Yeah.
We're out of time, so I'm just going to ask as a final note. You guys have made yourself sound super scary. Maybe
cool.
in like sort of 10 seconds or less, you could each just say one thing that's nice about working with us, or an advice on how to engage positively.
Speak honestly. We will deal with you honestly if we're dealing on the same terms. Fuck with us and we will screw you over.
That's a good note to land on there.
Right. And fini.
I want to say that generally speaking, I've been told I'm overly generous with my time with people who have questions about how they should interact with me. So I'm cool with people calling me and saying, how is the best way to approach you? What kind of stories are you looking at? What kind of things are you really interested in? Because the people who do that give me the best stories.
Yeah.
So, don't be afraid to reach out and call one of us and say, what do you want to hear about? What would this sort of a topic interest you, and how should I present it? Or just even if it's a story you're not giving to us. I mean, I've had meetings with people. I've had sat at the bar with people at Black Hat and DEF CON where I've said, they've come to me and said, how do I pitch this as a story? And I go through with them, say, this is what you need to do. You need to figure out who you're going to give it to. You need to give the motivating point behind it and all that, and deliver it, and it's worked out for them. So I'm happy to talk to people anytime. Everybody knows that apparently, because I have 9,000 unread email messages right now.
don't pick a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel. That is a very old saying. But here's the thing. These days, don't pick a fight with somebody who runs their own server, because they could constantly generate content and they'll bury you under it. But the problem that, like Jen said, we sound really scary, and we should be scary to a degree. We absolutely should. You should take caution when speaking with a journalist. But remember, if you give us the truth and you're honest and open with us, we're going to be the exact same way back. We have nothing to hide. So it's in our interest to have an honest, open relationship and conversation with you. It's always going to be that way.
Just briefly and more generally, journalists have failed. We have a massive distrust in the media at the moment. There's a serious media literacy problem as well, constant throwing of fake news. Readers don't quite understand what happens when they read an anonymous source. They think the journalist doesn't know who that person is, when of course in the majority of cases they are going to know. The fact that we're having this panel now, I mean, of course this is quite specific information, but clearly journalists need to do more to educate the public about what journalism actually is, and asking journalists these questions, and of course us reciprocating, is, I mean, literally the least we could do to actually try to combat literally try to combat it. Like, this is bare minimum.
Yeah. I mean, basically, we like to think we're operating in the public interest, that what we do is for the public interest. You approach us with that, and we'll be very receptive to it, because that is really what we are here trying to do. Despite the fact that everyone hates us, that's really all we're trying to do. And honestly, just come to us with that.
And scotch.
Yeah.
Come to us with scotch, and you'll really get our attention.
You don't like bourbon?
Hey, sure, whatever. Bourbon's fun.
It's not too sweet.
Please join me in thanking our awesome journalists for their time. Otherwise, I'll